They even managed to buy off old foes. For her silence, Hillary was rewarded, and she became the second largest recipient in the Senate of healthcare industry contributions.
But you don't feel that way anymore. Why not?
Well, the revolution never came.
I know how to go after what Republicans stand for.
Which enemy are you most proud of?
Well, in addition to the NRA, the health insurance companies, the drug companies, the drug companies, the drug companies, the drug companies.
And I think we are hesitant as elected officials to look at how we got here. Two senators said, well, you know, if we built higher walls on the Mexican border, we'd keep out the drug dealers that are bringing in this cheap heroin. And, you know, my response was, you know, we've had drug dealers on our borders for as long as I've been alive. And we probably always will, unfortunately. But what has changed? Like, why are they doing so well when they really weren't able to sell heroin in these quantities 20 years ago? And let's answer the question. It isn't the drug dealers on the South American border that are our biggest challenge. Believe it or not, yes, they're a big problem. But it is our drug dealers that are FDA approved, selling this stuff in every pharmacy in America. There isn't a governor here who doesn't know that. And in all due respect for the AMA, all my docs come out, or a lot of them, and get on the radio and start saying, oh, what's this governor talking about? We got folks with chronic pain, you know? He shouldn't be talking about how many to prescribe. What does he know? He's not a doctor. And I keep saying, well, yeah, I plead guilty. But, you know, you're doing such a good job of it with your medical degrees. 250 million prescriptions in a year. I don't need to be a doctor. I don't need to go to medical school to know that that is not okay. We've got 110 people in America that die every day from this. After the source, the root of the problem that has led us into this crisis. And I say until we do that, now there's going to be huge resistance. You know, let's be honest about this. Big pharma in this room, we've got a lot of friends with us. If I ask them to all raise their hands, raise your hand if you're working for a drug-related company, just out of curiosity. Come on, let's have the courage. How many? We can get all the naloxone and we can buy up more. Our biggest enemy, because, you know, I go back to the beautiful comments of Joanne Peterson. I have heard more stories like Joanne's, and so have we all. And you know what we do? We go, God, that's just so heart-wrenching. It's just so horrid. But, you know, we're up against some big financial pressures here. Just a few years ago, the combined pharmaceutical industry spent $235,000 per member of Congress lobbying for their views. Let's just get this out there. 435,000. That's big money. We are going to come up with protocols that make a difference. I'm just asking us, do we want to do it? Do we have the courage? Do we have the heart to do it?
So,
it shows you how hard it is to make these choices, which is why I'm calling the book Hard Choices.
Rogue State Rollback.
The health insurance companies, the drug companies, the drug companies, the drug companies.
Rogue State Rollback.
Drug corruption of the central institutions of society on a massive scale.
In the Netherlands, and what they found after 25 years is use does not go up. As a matter of fact, by every measure, Dutch people, young and old, smoke half the marijuana per capita that we do here in the United States.
We have the pharmaceutical industry pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into campaign contributions and lobbying, and the private insurance companies as well. What this is really about is not the rational way to go forward. It is whether we have the guts to stand up to the private insurance companies and all of their money and the pharmaceutical industry. That's what this debate should be about.
Literally.
You talk about leveling with the American people. Have you always told the truth?
I've always tried to. Always. Always.
There is a responsibility on the part of the pharmaceutical industry and the drug companies who are producing all of these drugs and not looking at the consequence of it. Virtually every major pharmaceutical company in this country has either been convicted of fraud, i.e. ripping off federal government, state government, or individuals, or else has reached a settlement. And we have got to get a handle on this crisis. Now, I want to read. I'm going to bore some people because it's a long list. Sadly, it is a long list. But it's a list that has to get out, and it is an issue that we have got to deal with. So here we go. Abbott Labs is one of the top 10 pharmaceutical companies in the world. It had $38.8 billion in revenues and $4.7 billion in profits in 2011. Just last month, Abbott reached an agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice to pay $1.6 billion for illegally marketing the anti-seizure drugs Depakote. Johnson & Johnson is the second largest pharmaceutical company in the world, which had $65 billion in revenues and almost $10 billion in profits in 2011. In 2012, this year, Johnson & Johnson illegally marketed Risperdal, an antipsychotic medication, to nursing home patients and paid over $2 billion in fines.
The manufacturer of OxyContin, let's talk about this for a second, Purdue, told our providers, nurses, docs, healthcare providers across America, we finally have a non-addictive painkiller. I mean, what a dream, right? Well, the folks started passing it out, and a lot of folks got on it and became addicted, and I think a lot of providers started going, wait a minute, this doesn't seem to be working out quite right. And they started looking at it, and, you know, I mean, this is a history we don't talk about much, but Purdue, the manufacturer, was taken to court. 3 of their executives were charged with lying to physicians that they had information that this was in fact addictive, but they told providers it wasn't. They paid a $70 million fine. Nobody went to jail. But in that same year, they sold $11 billion worth of painkillers. So, you know, I mean, math is tough for some politicians, but last time I checked, there's 1,000 million in a billion, and so they paid a $70 million fine, 11 billion sold. My point is, we all talk about how we can spend more resources fixing the problem, and we aren't willing enough to look at the global challenge. The global challenge is this. In 2010, we prescribed enough OxyContin in America to keep every adult in America high for a month. That's just a fact. In 2012, we sold 250 million prescriptions of OxyContin. I mean, we know we only have 250 million people in America, right? That's a bottle for every living adult. The FDA, just recently, and I say the FDA is part of our problem, they just approved Zohydro a couple of years ago, which is OxyContin on steroids, right? You can crush it, it's tamper resistant, you can shoot it, you can snort it. So we're right back there all over again. This year, they just approved, and on the Zohydro, it's important to note, their 13-member advisory panel, which is mostly docs, voted 11-3, do not approve Zohydro, because it'll be a bigger problem than OxyContin, but they did it anyway, right? Now this year, they approved OxyContin for kids. I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
Mr. President, in 2010, the pharmaceutical industry achieved a dubious distinction. It surpassed the notoriously corrupt defense contracting industry in defrauding the government. The pharmaceutical industry accounted for nearly half, $1.8 billion of a total of $4.1 billion of the penalties collected in 2011 by the Department of Health and Human Services Healthcare Fraud and Abuse Control Program. In 2012, and this is really quite amazing, the pharmaceutical industry is expected to pay out up to 4 times the amount of last year's penalty, between $8 to $9 billion. $8 to $9 billion in penalties due to pending fraud settlements with the Department of Justice. Virtually every major drug company has either been found guilty of or settled charges of significant fraud over the last 10 years. The question arises, and this really is an important question, is fraud within the pharmaceutical industry the exception? Does it just happen here or there, or is it simply put their business model? Is fraud the business model of the pharmaceutical industry, who think that in most cases they can get away with the fraud, make huge profits, and in some cases when they get caught, they will in fact pay a penalty, but the penalty will in no way match the kinds of huge profits they're making from their fraudulent activity. It is clear that the punishments that we now have on the books have not done enough to address this problem, because apparently the drug companies are not too intimidated by the laws on the books. They think it makes business sense for them to continue going forward on their fraudulent activities. The amendment that I am offering would send a strong and clear message to the drug industry. Illegal behavior will not be rewarded with continued government-granted monopolies. Our people are paying the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. One of the reasons is widespread fraudulent activity on the part of virtually every major drug company in our country. It is no longer acceptable to turn a blind eye to that crisis.
It's getting to the nature of these ethical and moral traditions that are embedded in the framework of human cultures. And when I reflect on the current state of affairs of humankind, it's a quantum change that occurs all or none. And this now is a model system for investigating how the human organism is capable of this radical change in perception and behavior